Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Know Your Enemy. This week, I'm joined by a very special guest who I spoke to in the preseason, previewing the Florida Gators, joined by Owen Warden over at the Red and Black Sports Desk, the assistant sports editor. Um, yeah, thank you for joining me, Owen.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, man. I love doing these. We just wrapped up doing one for our own podcast series. So it's always a pleasure and it's just fun. These are fun.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. This week we're gonna preview the storied Florida Georgia rivalry. And I'm just gonna ask Owen some questions to get some more insight on the Georgia Bulldogs. Number one in the country, undefeated, but not necessarily getting the same kind of buzz in terms of their dominance the past couple seasons. So, Owen can shed some light on how they're doing and just what their season has looked like so far. Kind of rolling into my first question is, can you talk about some of the team's strengths and weaknesses this season? Where are they really excelling and where could they still get some improvements?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's tough to really pick one area where they're excelling, but I mean, it feels like the passing game has looked really well. Carson Beck, obviously in his first year as a starter, has looked really well. I think he's been a very good player. At about 73.6% completion rating, throwing over 2,100 yards, 12 touchdowns, 4 picks, which isn't great, but you know still had a tremendous performance. Brock Bowers, who is not playing this week, has been stellar for the team. But aside from him, there's been plenty of other players, including Marcus Rosemy-Jackson, Dominic Lovett, Rod Thomas, plenty of other guys that have been impactful in the passing game and will likely continue to be impactful. With Bowers' absence, including Oscar Delp, who currently sits fifth for Georgia's receiving group. The young sophomore tight end will fill in for Brock, and I think he'll do a pretty solid job. But the running game hasn't been bad either. It hasn't been as consistently, dominant as it has been in previous years. But Dejon Edwards, Georgia's number one, uh, he's got 460 yards in the ground, 6 touchdowns. So the offense as a whole has been really solid, and the defense has continued to look great. The run stopping is great. Georgia held Ray Davis to about 50 yards, and Florida fans should know how dominant Ray Davis is as a running back. So clearly, Georgia's run stopping group is still really effective. Their pass coverage unit is really top tier. Um, Kamari Lassiter, who flashed some inconsistency last year, has been awesome. Has been just someone you don't got to worry about. It's one of the best safety groups I've ever seen with this Georgia program. So it's a really dominant group on both sides of the ball. But as far as weaknesses go, consistency with the offense, the big plays that everyone's so used to with Georgia football just hasn't always been there this year, which has caught the ire of many Georgia fans. And there's been moments, Kentucky definitely was the opposite of that. Georgia got rolling pretty quickly, but for a lot of games, Georgia starts pretty slow. And Georgia fans aren't a big fan of that. But also Georgia's linebackers have been a little iffy. A few blown coverages, not as dominant as they have been. And, the past few games have been solid for them. But if there's any weakness to point to maybe the defense, it might be them, as when it comes down to the one thing that Georgia really couldn't stop over the course of the season, it was the QB run. And you saw that mostly against Auburn, where they just weren't able to stop it. And a lot of that, I feel, falls down to the linebackers not being able to stop that. But in recent weeks, they've looked really solid. They've started to really step up their play. And, we'll see how it goes. But I would say those are probably the strengths and weaknesses of Georgia this year.
Nice. And, even those areas where maybe they're not as consistent or showed a little bit of weakness, I feel like just listening to you talk about this team where it's like maybe there's not an area where they're not necessarily dominant in, they're still just really, really good or really, really efficient. And I think that's just been really the story of this Bulldogs team the past 3 seasons and counting so far. But kind of going into my next question, just continue to talk about that. And you talked about starting slow in some of those games. How has the season gone so far for the Bulldogs? And can you kind of just walk me through the season?
Yeah, I mean, I can't say it's been going badly, especially when you're undefeated on the year so far. But, I think it's been a little bit more scary for Georgia fans than they would like. A couple times, South Carolina, Auburn, the game's tight. Georgia was trailing South Carolina by halftime. Um, and, I mean, they let UAB score 21 points on a Georgia defense that's just not expected. And, there's a couple times where there's a fumble where you wouldn't be happy about, it, and that's led to a touchdown. There's interceptions that lead to touchdowns, and it's these type of things that are unexpected for a Georgia team that's been so dominant on that side to a point that head coach Kirby Smart would be leaving in his starters for a little bit longer so he could complete shutouts, towards the end of seasons to keep up that streak, because clearly he really wanted that. But that's not the case this year. Backups are getting in a lot earlier. These leads are starting to happen, but ultimately Georgia's also shown a lot of resilience in those moments. They came back on South Carolina and won that relatively convincingly, and that with a second half performance. Auburn got really close towards the end, but ultimately they pulled it out, and Brock Bowers had an incredible game to give Georgia the win, and Carson Beck marched the team down, and everything was really scary, and no one really knew if Georgia had the ability to put up big time performances. And then they went out and put one up on Kentucky, who was ranked 20th at the time and has one of the best running backs in Ray Davis in college football. So it's a team that we know has that championship ability when they're playing at the top of their power, but they haven't been playing at the top this entire year. And it's curious because, Florida is the start of Georgia's, you know, meat and potatoes of the schedule, where things really get difficult, where, they travel to Jacksonville, but then they're back home for, you know, top 20 ranked Missouri and Ole Miss. And then they travel to Knoxville to take on Tennessee. And I know you guys got a win over them in the swamp, but man, I think we know how dangerous Knoxville is to play in. So, you know, Georgia's got a tough schedule here, and it's definitely going to be a prove it type of run to see if they can make an SEC run and if they can make a championship run. But it starts with this Florida game, and if they can recapture success they did against Kentucky, it'll be an interesting one.
I find that very interesting, just because the team's the number one in the country, undefeated to this point. They have looked dominant, as you mentioned, against teams like Kentucky. But then you still had some other games where maybe you're a little sluggish and not as consistent right out the gate, but still able to pull it out. So it'll be definitely interesting against this Gators team, where, as you mentioned, it's not the first real test, but the start of kind of the gauntlet of the schedule, so to speak. So that'll be definitely interesting to see how that plays out Saturday. And
Oh yeah.
we talked about this in the preseason. Both of Florida and Georgia have new quarterbacks this season. We talked about it on your podcast about Graham Mertz's performance, but I wanted to ask you, what have you seen from Carson Beck this season, and can you just talk about his performance at the Bulldogs?
Yeah, I think he's been great. We've been kind of talking about it here around the office and stuff like that, but just based off his performance, he's been kind of a top 3 quarterback in the SEC. Just the way he's been performing, and sure, he does love the check down. There's no doubt about that. He's got a lot of love for that play, but he also can push it downfield. And while there's times where maybe he's not hitting a guy that you want him to hit, or maybe him and Arian Smith just really can't connect for whatever reason, he still makes plays. He's still able to put the team on his back in moments and really lead them out to a large lead, like against Kentucky. So, as far as Stetson Bennett compares, I would not put him at the level that he's getting Heisman buzz, right? He's not at the level where, he's going to be he's going to be finishing 4th place in Heisman voting or anything like that. And, it's tough for Bulldog fans to see, because you get a Heisman quarterback and you would love to get another one, but Carson Beck's just not that. But what he is a very talented quarterback, and one that's played really well. There's a reason he's got over 2,000 yards already. There's a reason he's got 12 touchdowns. He's a good quarterback. He plays well, and he plays well in the offense and the scheme that he's got. And, you know, um, I'm not going to call him all world. I'm not going to call him a potential number 1 overall pick or anything like that, but a quarterback that can definitely win you football games. And I think, he had a little bit of a tough time playing in Auburn, but in that second half, he turned it around and had a great half. And, the one interesting thing about Beck is, it'll be his first time playing in Florida, starting for the quarterback for Georgia in Florida, but he's from Jacksonville. That's his native. That's where he's from. So if anything, if unlike anybody else really on that field, it's a home game for him at the very least. At the very least, it's a homecoming, kind of like it was for Brock Bowers when Georgia went out to California for the Natty. But you know, um, Beck's familiar with Florida. I doubt that area is going to be too tough for him, especially with it being a neutral site. But you never know. I think that if the first half struggles continue, we could see a similar thing to what happened in Auburn. But something tells me that he might be a little bit more comfortable playing in Jacksonville and playing in his hometown.
Nice. And to kind of go back to earlier when you already mentioned it, I want to ask a quick follow-up question is, how have you feel or how do you feel like he's looked filling the shoes of Stetson Bennett? Obviously, you said he's a quarterback who can win ball games, and he still looked really good. But as you mentioned, it can be tough for fans to go from a guy who is getting Heisman votes to a guy who has struggled a little bit in games, but for the most part, it's been good.
Yeah, I think it really it's just not getting the same like buzz. He doesn't have that same, next level spark that Stetson Bennett had where he's just making things happen, where just things are working out for him and he's just making big time throws and big time plays and stuff that, you're just like, wow, your jaw drops a little bit. You know, Beck definitely has the ability to do that. He's done that a little bit, but certainly not at the rate that Stetson Bennett was doing last year. And for that reason, I would not dare to compare them, let alone the fact that it feels like when Beck and Stetson Bennett stood next to each other, Beck looked a whole foot taller than the guy. So, they're different quarterbacks. They've got different play styles. They're mobile, but one's certainly more mobile than the other. Beck can make throws that Stetson couldn't make. He's got a little bit more arm talent just naturally, but you know, Beck had a spark that was existent all throughout last season, and that's the reason that he ended up going to New York for the Heisman Trophy award ceremony. And Beck probably won't get there, but he's definitely been a good quarterback, one that can lead a team to wins, and we'll see how far that ends up actually getting this team. And but I feel pretty good about Beck. He's had good performances, and Kentucky really was the game that made me think that, yeah, this guy's a dude. This is a dude.
Nice. And it's always nice having that one game where you're like you kind of feel like you have a feeling about a guy where you have these feelings and then it's all confirmed and you're like, okay, yeah, there we go. So, kind of similar with me with Mertz in South Carolina. That was kind of the game where I'm like, okay, he does have the ability to push the ball down the field. Like he can win ball games like this. So just nice to hear and interesting input. But kind of looking at to the other side of the ball, Georgia under Kirby Smart has been known for just some extremely dominant defenses. And as you mentioned, talking about the safety room is extremely talented this year, and that team is always just filled with guys who you're going to see on Sunday. So can you talk about just Georgia's defense and some guys to look out for?
Oh man, it's tough because there's so many names. There's so many guys that you are going to see on
Yeah.
Sundays and stuff like that. So I'll try and limit it to just a few, and I'll start with the
Okay.
secondaries. I kind of hyped them up the most. Malachi Starks, the sophomore safety, has been tremendous. His impact, sometimes it's been seen where he gets an interception and he shuts down a play and he's following a guy all the way and stuff like that. He's been tremendous, and then sometimes his impact isn't seen where he's just doing the unseen things, where he's doing the small things to make sure that other guys are getting in position, where he's helping get sacks and pressure and stuff like that. He's been tremendous and absolutely a name to keep an eye on. But Tyke Smith, 4 interceptions on the year. The former West Virginia transfer, it's been a couple of years for him where he's been battling through injuries and stuff like that. He's here and he's ready to play. Leads the team with interceptions with 4. One of the top guys in the NCAA with interceptions. He's been a great player in both the pass game and the run game. Couple lapses here and there, but definitely a guy to keep an eye on. And Javon Bullard, the third of that safety group, he's been great too. Defensive MVP in both of Georgia's playoff games last year, and he's playing that way again now at a safety instead of that star role that Tyke's playing in now. That star role, of course, being that slot nickel corner type position. So those 3 guys have been great. Kamari Lassiter, cornerback, has been tremendous. But then, as far as other guys that may break out, Smile Munden, the linebacker, could definitely be someone that you got to keep an eye on. Really athletic guy, one of the best linebackers probably in this upcoming draft class. He's a really talented guy that started the season hurt, but has been getting healthier and healthier each week. Currently leads the team in tackles. And then Michael Williams, sophomore defensive end. He's been quiet a little bit after he got sick, but in the South Carolina game, he was absolutely dominant, taking on multiple blocks, getting tons of pressure. He's a great player and a pass rusher that I think that if Florida's got to worry about anybody, he might be the one, but there's also a million other names: Nazir Stackhouse, Warren Brinson, Zion Logue, so many different dudes that could come at you, let alone Chaz Chambliss, Marvin Jones Jr. There's so many names, and if I keep going, I could name so many guys on this defense that could be impactful or could be talented. So I think I'll cut myself off there of some of the guys that are talented.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously some great players to watch out for, as you've already mentioned, but you know, this team is just Kirby's doing such a good job recruiting and developing these guys, and really just top to bottom going through that whole depth chart. There's guys who are going to make an impact on Saturday, but you know, those are some names to look out for, and it's going to be interesting seeing how Florida's passing game, where they're just starting to finally push the ball downfield, and now they're going to go up against what'll likely be the best secondary they'll face all season. So it's going to be really interesting to see how guys like Pearsall and Trey Wilson, how they match up um, against guys like that. So that'll be fun to see.
Oh yeah, yeah, it's really interesting, and there's been a couple lapses. There were a couple moments where there was a couple Kentucky players wide open, and there were a couple moments where Vanderbilt, found ways to expose the Georgia secondary. So there's definitely moments where that could happen, but there's just so much talent and athleticism back there that it's hard to be like, it's a really good group. It's a good group, and you're gonna have to
Yeah,
face it and worry about it.
yeah, I agree. So it'll be tough for Florida. They're definitely going to have to be on their A game if they want to move the ball down the field if they're passing the ball, and especially if they go down and they're in a situation where they have to throw the ball. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. So those are some key guys on the defensive side of the ball. We've talked about Carson Beck. Switching over to the offensive side of the ball, who are some guys around him uh, who are going to be names to watch out for? Obviously, Brock Bowers is one of the most talented players in the country, if not the most talented player in the country. But he suffered that injury and won't be playing. So who are some other guys who are going to make an impact on the offensive side of the ball?
Yeah, absolutely. And I've talked about a few of these guys, but Dejon Edwards, the running back, again, 460 yards on the year, 6 touchdowns. That's their primary running back. And for a Florida team that struggled a little bit in run stoppage and defending against the run, there's a good chance Dejon Edwards has himself another game. And he's a big reason why Florida was able to put away Vanderbilt was his ability on the ground and him taking over that game, especially after Bowers went out. So Dejon, definitely a name to keep an eye out in the running game. And a lot of people know the name of Vlad McConkey. And McConkey was dealing with a back injury early in the year. That's why he's a little bit lower on the board, but he's still seventh in receiving, and he's slowly been working back. And you can kind of tell he's starting to get healthy again. And without Brock Bowers, a guy that's obviously going to take a lot of the targets. He had 41 receptions, most on the team by a long shot, 10 more than the next guy. So he was a guy that was getting the ball a lot, and I think a lot of those targets are going to start going to Lad, especially because he's healthy, he's back, and is certainly an impactful guy, as we've seen in previous years. But you got plenty of other receivers as well. Marcus Rosemy, Jack Saint, who's second on the team in receiving yards with 333. He's got 2 touchdowns himself. Dominic Lovett, the transfer from Missouri, second in receptions with 31. He's at 282 yards, 1 touchdown himself. He actually got his first one against Vanderbilt. And then Ra Thomas, another incredible player, transfer from Mississippi State. That's an X that can do so many things athletically, a really talented player. All four of those wide receivers are really, really good. And again, I gotta credit Oscar Delp for his ability to be effective tight end. He was the number two. He was the fifth leading receiver on the team. And with Bowers gone, I think he's only going to get even more targets. He's still a talented guy, a highly rated 4-star, similar to Bowers. Not that I'm comparing them as a player right now, because Bowers is otherworldly, but Delp is really talented. So even though Brock Bowers being gone is going to be difficult for this team to not have, just because it's tough losing your number one, ultimately, I think that there's so much talent in this receiving core, as well as, guys like Dejon Edwards in the backfield. And, even Georgia's running backs are starting to get healthier. So you're actually starting to get a little bit of a depth chart there. All of that, I think, should alleviate the loss of Brock Bowers, but it's certainly going to affect Georgia's ability to be high powered and really get big chunk plays without a guy like Brock.
Yeah, I agree. And talking about that, with the loss, where it gives Florida more of a chance to maybe slow Georgia's offense down. They still have so many guys who all across the field, similar to the defense, who are just very talented players who are still going to be able to make an impact, and guys to look out for. And talking about Florida's run defense, where the way they started the season, they looked great stopping the ball. And then, as they've gotten into SEC play against, as we've mentioned, Ray Davis in Kentucky, he ran all over them. And even in the win against South Carolina, they still had a lot of success moving the ball both through the air and on the ground. So it'll be interesting to see how Florida's defense, if they can kind of get back to where they were first few games against, even when the loss against Utah, they still looked good defensively. And I guess in the win against Tennessee, they looked great defensively. So um, it's gonna need a return like that to give themselves a chance to win against a Bulldogs team that still has a lot of weapons offensively.
Oh, definitely. But again, there is a reason that Florida's, the third best pass defense in the country. And they're absolutely going to give Georgia a challenge. And I'm excited to see what that challenge ends up being because, Georgia hasn't really faced a big time challenge other than, themselves not getting off to a hot enough start. So they need a little bit of resistance. And I think that Florida secondary has a good chance of giving them some.
I agree. And, that kind of goes to my next question where, as of recording, recording this Wednesday night, I believe Georgia's 14.5 point favorites. Obviously they're still favored by a lot for a reason. Number one team in the country, very talented. But, as we've mentioned, there's a couple things where if, it goes Florida's way, if they can take advantage of certain areas, such as that pass, forcing Georgia to throw and then taking advantage of that pass defense. And then, maybe starting out hot versus a Georgia team that sometimes starts out a little slow. It can give Florida a chance to, make it a game. So, if this game comes down to the wire, if it comes down to maybe 1-2 possessions, what would you say is the deciding factor that will sway it, whether it'll sway it to Georgia or Florida?
I think the biggest thing is ultimately Florida needs to, if Georgia does get off to one of their slow starts, right? If Georgia does struggle early on out the gate, if Georgia's not able to, take a strong lead, Brock Bowers was a key reason this team was able to come back against a team like Auburn after struggling in the early parts of the second half. He put the team on his back. He brought them to a victory. He's not there now, and Dejon Edwards did this for Georgia against South Carolina, where he put the team on his back, broke his rushing yards record for a season, which he eventually promptly broke against Vanderbilt. But, he's done that before, but that's it. You don't have anybody on this team that's been able to put the team on their back and really lead them to a victory if they get down. And if Georgia faces adversity, it's even tougher for them to come back. So if Georgia does get out to a slow start, which they love to do, they do it all the time. If they do that, Florida needs to grab a hold of that lead and not let go. They need to rely on that pass defense. They need to rely on their defense possibly being able to stop the run and at least contain Dejon so that way Carson Beck has to find a target that's not Brock Bowers to throw to. And as long as he can do that, and as long as Florida can do that, they can hold on to a lead and they can win this game because it's tough to try and come back against Georgia. We saw that with Kentucky. Georgia got out to a big lead and that defense just shut Kentucky down through the air and just wouldn't let them run the offense they wanted to. But if you can hold on to a lead over Georgia and you can just hold on to that and ride the bull, so to speak, I think Florida's got a good shot at that. But there's a lot of circumstantial stuff. It's got to happen in a certain way. But if it does, Florida's got a good shot at this.
Yeah, I agree. And, talking about that, where if Florida can take advantage, if they can slow Georgia down and just kind of play at their pace, then I think that's going to give them a shot to win. But as you mentioned, it's a lot of circumstantial things. A lot of things have to go right for Florida in order for that to happen. So kind of just taking a little step back of that, how do you see these two teams matching up? And obviously Georgia, a very good team, but where do you see, if any, Florida has any advantages, and where do you see Georgia having the most advantage?
I mean, I feel like Georgia just kind of always has the most advantage, at least in the run game, kind of against any team they face, even if the team, really has one of the best running backs like Kentucky does, because Ray Davis is one of those dudes. He's that kind of talent. And ultimately, Georgia's run game itself is really strong. And the only way you can really exploit that is if you have a running quarterback, which Graham Mertz is not. He's got what, negative 56 rushing yards on the season or something like that.
Yeah, it's I don't know off the top of my head, but it's not great. It's not
No,
ideal.
it's not great. And that's kind of one of the stats I really looked at going to the Kentucky game and why I thought Georgia could stop the run pretty well there. So I think Georgia is definitely going to be able to efficiently stop the run. And I think that, Ricky Pearsall's going to give this Georgia secondary some issues for sure. But aside from Ricky and even Trey, those two guys might give Georgia some trouble. But aside from those two, I think Georgia might be able to hang with Florida's wide receiving group and be able to kind of alleviate and delegate its corners and defensive backs and safeties to do what they need to do to get that win. So, if anything, I think maybe Florida's maybe got an advantage over Georgia in being able to cover the pass and being able to handle that. Just because we don't know really who's going to be the number one. Bowers went down, then it's a bye week. So we haven't seen what Georgia's offense looks like without Brock Bowers for a long, long time, considering he's been here and starting since he was a freshman. So, but we're going to find that out. We're going to find out who will step up. And, under Todd Monken last year, the former offensive coordinator, sometimes Brock Bowers just wouldn't be in the game plan. And, everyone would be confused about it. But ultimately, we saw guys like Ladd McConkey step up and play really good football. And guys like A.D. Mitchell the year before step up and play really good football. And, it'll be curious to see who ends up stepping up for this team when Brock Bowers isn't the center of the game plan, let alone in the game plan at all. So if Georgia can find Ladd McConkey some success, if they can get their highly rated transfers involved in the game, they can find a way. But if they can't, Florida's secondary is definitely going to excel, and I think that's maybe where, if Florida's got an advantage at all, it may be in the secondary. But I think we'll find that out and have a more accurate knowledge of that in game rather than right now, just because we don't know what this offense looks like just yet.
Yeah, I agree. And you talk about possibly having that advantage for Florida in the secondary. I think uh it'll be so interesting seeing some of these freshmen in Florida's defense in the secondary, like Jordan Castell, like Jakeem Jackson, where obviously no Brock Bowers, but still a very talented team. So, this is going to be a great barometer for them where it's a neutral site, huge rivalry game, number one team in the country. How are they going to hold their own getting this playing time? So I'll be fascinated to see how that plays out and if, they can take advantage of any possible, cracks or missteps in Georgia's offense. So, we've talked about, the matchups. We've talked about the circumstances that would need to happen for Florida to make it a game. But ultimately, how do you see this game playing out? And can you give me a final score prediction?
Ultimately, I do think Georgia takes this one just because there's a lot of talent. And again, I'm not counting Florida out at all. I hope that hasn't been the thought of this, because Florida is really talented. They've got a lot of fight, and Billy Napier's got them fighting. Um, but I do think just talent wise, they're still just a step back. And ultimately, I think that Georgia ends up taking this one 32-17, simply for the fact that, yeah, I think this is just one of those times where Ladd shows up this year for the first time, that Oscar Delp proves why he was a highly rated recruit for Georgia and what he's learning behind a guy like Brock Bowers, and the defense shows why they're still as dominant as they are. I think this game has all the indications of that, and I think Georgia does pull the way, although I still think Florida finds a way into the end zone at least a couple times.
Yeah, I agree. And, as we mentioned in your podcast, when I made my final score prediction, we're kind of on the same wavelength where, you're saying 32-17. I said 31-17 Georgia. So, both similar mindset there. And, I agree. I do think Florida has the chance to keep it competitive. We're both saying only 14, 15-point loss, which isn't horrible, looking at the circumstances. And it's more so a matter of just trying to close that gap, trying to close that gap skill wise. Uh, I trust Napier as a talent evaluator, so you know, it's trying to keep it close and building for the future. I think is sort of the main goal for Florida, and Georgia is still a really good team, albeit maybe some slow starts this year. They're still undefeated, but it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. Anything can happen in a rivalry game. But I believe we'll both be down in Jacksonville for the game, so it'll be exciting just to be able to cover that one. Uh, but yeah, again, thank you so much for coming on, Owen. Uh, just real quick, as a quick shout out for those in the Athens and Gainesville area. We both just put out our rivalry edition between the Independent Florida Alligator and the Red and Black. So, if you're in the area, make sure to check that out. We both have stories in the paper. Uh, Both had a lot of fun getting to work on that project. It's always a blast. So, make sure to check that out. And Owen, where can people find your work?
Yeah, other than in that lovely paper that we got to produce, you can find me on Twitter/X, however you'd like to call it. But for me, it'll be Twitter at Owen_Warden_. And you can also find all my stuff on the Red and Black website or at redandblack/sports. Got great football coverage. Or hey, if you're ever interested in looking back a year and finding some of my old soccer content, give that a read too. Why not? But we have great stuff, and our relation. I know that these two teams and these two fan bases hate each other, but I'm so thankful for the relationship that we've got with the Independent Florida Alligator. It's great to be able to produce paper stuff like this, do podcast stuff like this, and stuff like that. So absolute blast. But yeah, check my stuff out there, and of course, make sure you support student journalism and read both of our stuff wherever you find it, especially in that paper. It's nice. It's got a nice glossy finish this year.
Oh yeah, exactly. It looks great on both ends. But yeah, again, thank you so much for joining me. As you said, support student journalism. These two schools are hated rivals, but like I said, or like you mentioned, it's always a pleasure getting to do work and collaborative stuff like this. So again, thank you for joining.
Oh, absolutely. Always a pleasure, man.
Yeah. So thank you again for tuning into another episode of Know Your Enemy. This has been Know Your Enemy previewing the Florida Georgia matchup with Owen Warden from Red and Black. Thank you.